Hello, and welcome to Anchored Hope, where we find hope for our lives through reading and studying God's Word, the Bible. My name is Melinda, and my goal is to help us understand what we're reading so that we can get to know God better. This week, we're in Genesis 9 through 11. If you haven't read them yet, I recommend that you stop the recording and go read them, and then please do come back. God's words are the best words, and I don't want you to miss the best part. In the last video, we talked about the great flood in which God judged sin by wiping out creation and starting again with Noah, his wife, their sons, and the sons' wives. What a warning to us in our society today where we're so complacent about sin. This week, we'll be talking about how humanity began to multiply and fill the earth and spread out over the whole world. But right away, we see that even though God had cleansed the earth from the sin that they had been doing before the flood, humanity is still sinful, and we just aren't going to get away from that. So starting in chapter 9, verse 18, we read that Noah planted a vineyard. It's possible that the environment and the landscape had changed, and possibly he didn't know how strong that wine was going to be, but the passage doesn't really say that. More likely, he knew what wine would do, and he just wanted to relax after such a stressful few years that he had had. But even a godly man like Noah still sins, and he took his drinking to excess and became drunk. In the ancient world, nakedness was a huge disgrace and brought dishonor to the entire household. Years later, a Greek writer, Herodotus, described a man named Gyges who, after accidentally seeing a naked woman, had to either kill himself or kill the woman in order to restore the honor of both families. We're so used to the idea of nudity in our society that we don't think anything of it. But in those days, it was a really big deal. Ham knew that this was a big deal, and he considered it something to mock his father about. He even shared it with his brothers so they too could enjoy their father's shame. But Shem and Japheth were horrified by this breach of family honor, and they quickly walked backwards and covered their father without looking at him. Many people have suggested that Ham must have done more than just look at and mock his father, but the Bible gives no indication of this. And the disgrace of being found naked was enough in those days, in that ancient world, to occasion Noah's strong condemnation. Ham, Noah's youngest son, had disgraced Noah's family, and so Noah proclaims a curse on Ham and on Ham's youngest son as well. The curse on Ham's son Canaan is hard for us modern people to understand, and it has been misused to justify all sorts of evil as well. So it's worthwhile to take a little bit of time to discuss it. The first thing to point out is that a curse has no power on its own. Noah's words would only come true if God also agreed with Noah. So it's not just that Noah is misjudging Canaan. By the time Moses is writing this record, it had become obvious that the descendants of Canaan had picked up that moral degradation of their ancestor Ham and taken it to a far greater extreme. God was about to judge Canaan, the Canaanite people, the descendants of Canaan, for their immorality, their idolatry, and the evil they were doing. Noah's prediction may stem as much from what God knew was going to happen as it did from what Ham's actions were at that time. Second, there's no racial component to this curse. The descendants of Ham at this time did not look much different from the descendants of the rest of Noah's sons. Over time, Ham's descendants would include a variety of Eastern and African peoples. These verses were used to justify slavery in the American South, but the Canaanites were not Africans and did not have very dark skin. There's no mention here of permanent enslavement throughout the ages. This was a specific pronouncement about a specific people group for a specific reason. It was never a demand that other people should oppress all descendants of Ham forever. Sinful humans who want to oppress other people will twist and use whatever seems to be respected in their culture to justify what they want to do. And the American slave owners tried to use the Bible to justify their own evil actions, but it's twisting the Bible in ways that neither God nor Moses ever intended the Bible to be used for. We need to be careful in our own day not to do the same thing with social issues that we care about. There are several similarities between Genesis 2 and Genesis 9, which show that God is restarting the development of mankind. In Genesis 2, God plants a garden. In Genesis 9, Noah plants a vineyard. In both, the humans use the fruit of the garden in a sinful way. In both, a man realizes that he's naked. Both lead to a curse. In Genesis 2, the curse is on the snake and on the land. And in Genesis 9, the curse is on Ham and Canaan. In both situations, the blessing of multiplying and filling the earth becomes tainted and less than the ideal that we would hope for. But from this point onward, we see humanity continuing to grow and to increase, and God has promised not to wipe them all out ever again. They're still waiting for that promised seed of the woman to rescue them from the curse of sin. Chapters 10 and 11 begin to show how humanity spread throughout the earth. They're not sequential in time. Chapter 10 does not come before chapter 11, but the two chapters go together. Chapter 10 tells us where the people went, and chapter 11 tells us why the people went there. There's a surprising amount of information available to those who want to study chapter 10 in depth. I used to think there wasn't much out there about this, but actually there is a lot available if you want to look into it. All but one or two of the names can be found in people groups that are known to archaeology from the very earliest times. And there's other ancient records, such as those of Josephus and even secular sources like Herodotus and some of the ancient mythologies that tell us where these people groups were located, and we can find some records of them. Some DNA studies are also being done right now that are just fascinating. It is beyond the scope of this series to discuss this in detail, but for the most part, it can be said that the descendants of Japheth went mostly northeastward into areas of Russia and Siberia, and northwestward into Europe, including the coastlands of the Mediterranean, places like Greece and Italy and Spain. Most of the descendants of Ham went southwest into Africa, but many also went a little bit to the east toward the Orient, and some stayed in the Middle East as well. The descendants of Shem mostly stayed near the Middle East, near Mesopotamia, and they founded several of the major civilizations of the area. And throughout history, we see a lot of battling between the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Ham for supremacy in Mesopotamia. The total number of nations listed is 70, which corresponds to the number of descendants of Jacob that Moses will be listing at the end of Genesis as having gone into Egypt. Shem, Ham, and Japheth undoubtedly had many more grandchildren than those listed, maybe even more children as well. But these are the main ones who would have had interactions with the children of Israel that the Israelites would have known about at the time of Moses. Each major family is said to be listed, each with his own language, by their clans, and in their nations. So this phrase ties together chapters 10 and 11, as it tells us that when the languages were divided, these groups shared the same language and traveled outward from Babel together. Only two individuals are listed are brought out separately in chapter 10. These are Peleg, and it tells us that in his day the earth was divided, so it gives us a little bit of a time frame for when the Tower of Babel would have taken place, and Nimrod. Nimrod is a fascinating character, and there's a lot of speculation about him. There are several ancient rulers in Mesopotamia who share characteristics with him, but the Bible tells us only a few specific things about him. We're told that he founded a number of cities, both in the area that would become Babylon and the area that would become Assyria. Much of the area of Sumer was settled by him and his descendants. Our English Bibles say that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The Hebrew Bible carries more the idea of in the face of the Lord, as in against the Lord, or that he's hunting in a way that is not right. And ancient Jewish writers say that he was a hunter of man. So we see that he was a powerful empire builder, maybe the first tyrant, the first dictator, and one who was oppressing the people around him. Many people have said that Nimrod led the events at the Tower of Babel, and the timing is just about right for that, but the Bible does not say that specifically. One other thing should be noted about this genealogy. Some have criticized the list of nations in Genesis 10 because in some manuscripts, the book of Luke in the New Testament adds an additional name in the line of Shem between Arpachshad and Shelah. And this is also found in some of the later versions of the Septuagint. However, the earliest manuscripts of Luke do not have this name, and the earliest Septuagint manuscripts that we have also do not have this name. So it seems like this was added by a copyist error in the early Middle Ages and was not in either passage originally. Moving into chapter 11, then, we look at why the people moved away from each other. The first thing we see is that they were moving around looking for a good place to settle. And as they did this, they decided they didn't want to be spread out over all the earth. They wanted to make a name for themselves. This would be about 200 years after the flood, and some scholars have estimated that there were probably about 3,000 people at that time. They wanted to be important. They wanted to be famous. They wanted to make a name for themselves and not be scattered over the whole earth. Secular history also shows us that from this very earliest time, they were already turning away from God and worshiping idols. So they built a tower that would reach to the heavens where they thought that their gods were. They would be able to observe the heavens from it. And the tower would stand in their honor and make them famous. It's unlikely that they expected to be able to escape a flood on a tower like this. If that were the case, they probably would have started on a mountaintop instead of in the plain. The later Sumerians in the area built many other ziggurats that were step pyramids in temple complexes where it was thought that the gods would come down to visit them and to bless the humans around them. And it may be that the early post-flood people also had the same idea. They seem to have thought that they could control the heavens in this way, making themselves great and reaching as high as the gods by their human ingenuity and strength. But despite their lofty ideas and this tower they were building upwards, the Bible says that God had to come down to see it. Sometimes I think God has a sense of humor. They're building this great thing, but God is looking down at it. As in other cases, this doesn't mean that God didn't know what they were doing, but he came down in a way that made it obvious to them that he was observing them and he was not pleased. Working together, they were quickly going back to exactly the kinds of sins they had been judged for before the flood. They were doing whatever they wanted to do, and it was not good. And so God divided them and forced them to obey his command to spread out through all the earth by confusing their languages. Many people today have the idea that languages arose from the animals with progressively specific grunts for various things. However, it's notable that the ancient languages are far more specific than our modern ones. For example, English has 3 pronouns for me. It has I, me, and mine. Ancient languages have as many as 8 endings for the different pronouns. Languages have become simpler over time, not more complex. And anyone who has tried to learn a foreign language knows how baffling it can be. Not only are there different words, but the words are in a different order. Some languages have ideas like a different word ending depending if the box is facing to the right or facing to the left, if it's on top or underneath the box. When God confuses the languages, he does a really, really good job. And the whole cultures also seem to be different after this. It's hard to overstate how devastating this was. God himself came down and judged the peoples, leaving them unable to communicate with each other, fighting and jostling for power. And eventually, most of them just took off and went into other parts of the world. Native Americans in Mexico even have this as part of their legend, and it says that they wandered about 200 years before they found the land where they wound up settling and making their new home. Whatever skills your family had, that's what you had when you got to your new living place. If you had a potter in your group, you were blessed because that potter could make pots for you. If you didn't have that, you were going to have to make do with what you had until you had opportunity to trade with someone who did. But even if you had a potter in your group, it would take a while before he learned where the sources were of earth that he could use to create the pottery, because not all dirt can be used for that. That's what I've been told by friends who are potters, at least. So as you traveled around, you might not find the stones that you need to make a house. You might live in a cave for a while. Things that you had been able to grow in Mesopotamia where it was warm, you might not be able to grow in Europe where it was cold. And in the meantime, any group of other people that you came across They might fight you, or you might be able to trade if you could figure out how to communicate. And for a long time, there was no translators available who could speak both languages. So it would have taken them several hundred years to reach a new level of strength and be able to begin to develop their civilizations again. So now we have humanity split into groups, each pursuing their own way, trying to survive in small family groups around the world, still living in sin, still oppressing each other, but God still has a promise and God still has a plan. God promised to send a descendant of the woman, a seed, to crush the serpent and deliver mankind from evil. Having explained now what happened to all the rest of the world, Moses turns to tell us how God will pick a particular family to make himself known in a special way. God's plan is to bless the entire world through that family. And he begins to establish them, to work with them, to teach them his ways, and to develop them. And from them, he will bring this promised son. The last part of chapter 11 tells us about these descendants that will bring the promised one, starting with the line of Shem. Moses gives us ages for each of these men, including the age when they had the child who would carry that line down, and their age when they died. From these ages, we can see that the human lifespan drops very quickly from Shem's 600 years down to Terah's 205 years, and it continues to decrease after that as well throughout the book of Genesis. From these dates, we can see that Noah may have overlapped Abraham by about 60 years, and Shem would have actually outlived Noah, living into the lifespan of Isaac and possibly even into the life of Jacob. It's amazing to consider that from Adam to Methuselah to Noah to Abraham, each could have gotten firsthand information about many of these things from their direct ancestor. So the next time we'll be looking at Genesis 12 to 15, the call of Abraham, and God's much more specific promises to Abraham about what God was going to do to bring salvation to the world. Have a great week.